I love that new intro.
I'm digging it.
Mr. Pine put together that intro for us with a flashy little countdown, and then somehow we dropped him during the pre-show warm-up, and now he's back.
Yeah, apologize. Microsoft Edge apparently just died. It ceased up entirely. So welcome to the show. I don't know what I missed, but good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And who do we have with us today?
We have Mr. Matt Millican. So the Midwestern is strong in today's episode. So down.
This way. So Matt,
yeah.
I was going to say, why don't you say a few words about yourself? Introduce yourself to the world here.
I think we might. Matt says he can't hear us.
Oh no.
Oh
no.
Audio.
What should we do? Press buttons? Hope for the best. Should Matt?
Yeah. Matt, go ahead and leave and come back, and we'll do the. Well, he can't hear us. Someone tell him in the chat to leave and come back, and we'll do the checkup.
Yeah, do that. We'll start the checkup. We'll roll that.
Cool. So for today's checkup, welcome to this segment, by the way. What we have is a doc that focuses on creating custom templates using, in this case, the .NET CLI. So if you were to run the .NET new command from the terminal and append to that the -L or -- list options, you would see a list of templates. And a lot of folks wonder, well, okay, so how do I create a template like that for my immediate team? And say you have some standards that you're trying to encapsulate into a project template or an item template. Turns out it is possible to create a template like that. And that's really what this doc focuses on. So if we scroll down here and show you a little bit of what's in here. So here's the command I had just mentioned, .NET new list will show you a list of installed templates. And then this configuration section goes into, what does a custom project template really consist of? And it's your source files. So that could be your project template or your item template. So like a C# file, MVC controller, web API controller, whatever that item might be. And then there's this configuration file that goes along with that. And that's where all of your metadata is stored for that particular template. That metadata file is actually named template.json, and you would put that inside of a .template.config folder, and that's mentioned further down here. There's a nice table in this doc that shows the required properties in that JSON config file. Turns out there's 6 properties that are required. And really what these do is, they drive behaviors in the template, and they also control the way that the template displays in the .NET CLI. So to show you a quick example, you'll notice in the table here, there's a short name property. And if you've used the .NET CLI at all with the .NET new command, you'd be very familiar with this short name column. And so you can kind of put 2 and 2 together and figure out that it's that short name property that determines the value that displays in this short name column. It's also in that metadata file that you can control things like the tags that display in this view and the languages. So is this a C# template? Is it F#? Those are, again, things that you would define within that doc. We'll shift back over to that doc for a minute. A couple more things I wanted to point out. This example here gives you a really nice depiction of what a project template or an item template could look like that you create. So in this case, they've created a My Template folder. They have a console C# file in there, and then this metadata file that I mentioned. And then here's an example of that config file. So you see there's a classifications array in here, and there are 2 items, common and console. Classifications is the property that corresponds to the tags column in the .NET new view in the terminal.
So Scott, let me jump in with a question real quick. So this metadata in the template.json file, does that have any bearing on anything other than like what you refer the template to, what you refer to it as in .NET New, and like what it displays in that column layout that you showed earlier?
Good question. So in this case, it's the way that you would invoke this template or use this template after it's installed is you would say .NET new followed by whatever the short name value is. So what I've highlighted is what would follow the .NET new command.
And I think this is a great time to segue into one of the reasons that we're trying to show this off, not because it's a cool feature, but it certainly is. But if you go back to the console window that you had up before, in that list of like the predefined templates, we see Angular and React and, other web-based things, but we don't see Vue.js. And that's a sad face moment for me because I'm a big fan of Vue.js. I like Angular as well. I guess I don't like React, but I mean, people are probably going to hate me for saying that. But Vue.js. So I think this is one of those opportunities where, maybe the community could put together a Vue.js template that is then maintained and then, gets, popularized and is something that's, part of the template system here. I think it's a great idea.
Yep, I totally agree with that. One last thing before we do get into the Vue.js conversation with our guest today, Matt Millican, I wanted to cut over to Visual Studio because naturally you will encounter teams who say, well, we'd rather not use the command line for our templates. We'd like to see these templates appear in Visual Studio as well. Visual Studio is just that environment we've used for years, and we're just comfortable and very productive in that environment. So if I change over to Visual Studio, what you're seeing here is actually the latest preview of Visual Studio 2019. And there's a new option that was added in this particular preview that I just learned of late last week. There's this checkbox called Show All .NET Core Templates in the new project dialog. If you were to check this, that would then make available in Visual Studio through File, New Project, any custom templates that you had created for the .NET CLI. Again, following that document that we showcased. So really cool. If that interests you, definitely enable this feature and experiment with that.
Before we hop off of that, can I ask a real quick question?
Go ahead.
So when we .NET New something, when we make a template to do .NET New, does the artifact that we use to create that template, is there any kind of special like templating language or anything that we use, or is it basically just an X copy of a project that we've created?
Well, so without going into too much detail, I would refer you to the latter section of this doc. It's going to talk about things like installation. So you could install from a local NuGet package or a NuGet package hosted on a feed somewhere, perhaps on NuGet.org or MyGet or Azure Artifacts, wherever you decide to put that package. Alternatively, you might say, well, we're not going to use a packages feed. We'll install this from the file system, at least until we know what we're doing. The second part of your question sort of gets to parameterizing things and how you could handle that. Any parameters required by the template can be added to that metadata file that I described earlier, the template.json. Those are not described. The parameterization options are not described in this doc. However, in the See Also section, there are resources that will get you to that information.
Cool. So templatize all the things.
Indeed.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that too?
Go ahead, Matt.
So this is for projects. What if I wanted to create a custom template controller template? Would it be the same kind of thing?
It's actually the same process for an item template. So let's say that you wanted to create a custom controller, because every time that you add a new controller to your web API, there are certain standards that you want to be followed by your team. You would just, again, create this template.json file inside of a .template.config folder and put your custom controller alongside that. And then when you package that up into a NuGet package, it just all gets installed appropriately.
Awesome.
Cool.
Should we cut over to our hallway track?
Let's do it.
Yep. So, Dave, could you introduce us? Actually, Scott was doing the introduction, wasn't he? I'm going to switch over to Scott. Scott, introduce us, please, to our guest this week, since we missed that part earlier.
Indeed, we have Mr. Matt Millican, and as I mentioned earlier, this is sort of a Midwesterner takeover, or we'll call it Midwesterner Monday. We've got Mr. Matt here from the Milwaukee area. Matt, why don't you introduce yourself to folks, talk a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm Matt Millican, or Millican Matt on Twitter. I lead the internal software engineering team at GMR Marketing in New Berlin, or my home office now with COVID. So I love .NET Core. I love Vue.js. Love cloud things and just making whatever I can to have fun with development and maybe improve people's jobs while doing it.
Cool. So, sort of a follow-on question to that, Matt. So it sounds like you've been doing a lot of single-page app development. Vue.js is one, I guess, recent example of when you've been working on that.
Mm-hmm.
How was it? You mentioned your .NET Core experience. How was it that you landed on Vue.js as your preferred SPA framework?
I think it was actually you. I used, this goes back to a conversation we had probably a couple of years ago now, but I used Angular for a while, both the old style and the new style, and it was okay and just wasn't really feeling it. And then I was never a fan of React.js. Like David said, I'm probably going to get shamed for saying that, but
Probably, yeah.
So I just kind of started tinkering with Vue, and admittedly, it took me a while to get into spas in the first place. I was always much more comfortable in, Razorland and controllers and all of that. But yeah, I started tinkering with Vue. I like the syntax of it a lot more than React or Angular, and just kind of, I guess, connected with it, so to speak. So,
Sure. So let me ask, because I have my opinions that I'll share, but I wanted to hear yours first. What were some things from Angular land that you just didn't like that sort of drove you to consider a different solution?
It's honestly been so long since I've even looked at Angular. I know you could do quote single file components, but it wasn't really kind of the norm. And that's one thing I like about Vue. Everything is together, but it's still clean. Like I can still follow my presentation and my logic and all of that from piece to piece. The other thing that I liked about Vue.js, and we'll look at in a little bit here, is it's not, you can use it as a spa, but you don't have to. If you want to make a little subsection of your application be more dynamic and you don't want to use jQuery, Vue is a great drop-in because it's super lightweight, it's easy to get started. You don't have to go through a whole bunch of ceremony to like Webpack it and all of that. So there's that piece. And then, go ahead, David.
I was going to say that's a really good point, and actually LQ Dev 1 calls attention to that, where it seems really lightweight, and he mentions like it's more almost like jQuery like. And I love the fact that jQuery is still so prevalent in the web space. I've seen a lot of people actually using jQuery in conjunction with Angular, which is like, wait a second, what are you doing here, right? So yeah, it's really interesting. And LQ Dev 1 also calls out that the docs are really, really well done with Vue.js. So I would say I'd like to echo the fact that if docs are good, typically adoption of something is going to be good as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing too, and again, I know there's ways to do it, but along the same lines with Vue.js, if you don't need a router, you don't have to have it. If you don't need state management, you don't need that. Like it's all kind of a la carte. You don't, whatever you need, you can pull in, or if you don't like how part of it works, it's pretty easy to swap out for something that suits your needs better.
So
Cool.
well, let
Uh,
me.
go,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead, Ken.
So
Go ahead.
let me ask something. So I am like a UI. UI is like the last thing in the world I ever want to do. Um, would Vue.js be something that you would encourage me to pick up if I'm like, okay, I got a UI project and I don't want to do it, but yeah, I really ought to look at like a SPA framework here. Would you feel like that's one that I should crack into as a UI? As a UI, I don't want to say newbie, but a guy that avoids UI because I don't like wrapping my brain around it.
Yeah, definitely. I think the docs are super easy to get started with, like David and LQDev1 said. Um, you don't have to dive in like full force with, React or Angular. You can, like I said, pick what you want. If you just want to, like, let's say you have a comment form on your blog and you just want to make that a little bit more dynamic, it's really easy to drop Vue.js in and just start there. You don't have to start with a full SPA application.
Cool.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So it's almost like you can sprinkle in the JavaScript where you need it, which is ideal. And being that it's like more of a mature SPA framework, it's not just vanilla JavaScript, right? You get to do more with it. There's more like templating and binding and things like that. So it becomes a little bit more, like you mentioned, is like a dynamic way to inject something that's not vanilla JavaScript. So out of curiosity, you're doing .NET Core with that. And since there was no template, like how did you even start? Like what did you do to kind of architect the way that you're building out your projects and solutions with that?
Well, it of course kind of depends on what I'm trying to do. If I am doing a full SPA, then I I build my API in .NET Core using the API template. And then I usually have the front end in a separate repo. But if I'm, getting back to the whole little component section, I will just kind of pull in the Vue.js single file, I guess, and add that to my page. If you want to jump over, I can show you some code.
Yeah, sure. So there's a button near the bottom of the form to share your screen. Go ahead and share your screen with us, Matt, and let's take a look.
Yeah, we love looking at code.
Hopefully this is good code to look at.
Well, Matt's working on switching over. There was one other conversation I wanted to start here, and that is, how do you, given those three options for building a SPA, Angular, React, Vue, my personal experience has been that Vue.js is often discounted by the larger organizations because it doesn't have that, I guess,
Backing.
tech Goliath backing.
Yeah.
You look at Angular, that's Google, and you look at React, and that's Facebook. And so I think that brings comfort to a lot of decision makers, just knowing that these frameworks work at those companies' scales, and that there will be, I guess, the perception is they'll get better support, a more reliable solution, whether it's true or not, just because of that large company backing. And so I'm wondering, Matt, have you been using Vue.js at work at all? And have you run into what I'm describing here, where you bring Vue.js or something like it to your management team, and they say, well, we'd rather really consider something that has a stronger backing?
Yeah, I joined my team after they had already adopted React. So I wasn't part of that discussion. We did recently start a new project that we could have used Vue.js for, but we didn't really want to make the team dive into a whole new framework after just having done one project in React. But I definitely see what you were saying about the backing. So I haven't experienced it firsthand, but I can see how it's an issue.
I was really excited at first to think that, you would have gone in there and been like, forget React, we're doing Vue.js, right? Just lay down the hammer.
I can imagine Matt just kicking down the door and saying it's Vue.js or nothing at all.
Yeah, and kind of along those lines, I can share this link. But as far as like big tech adoption, this is a project that I really like to follow for Vue.js architecture. And this is from Netflix. This is like their incident management portal.
Can you zoom in a little bit there real quick, Matt? Sorry, just the screen's a little bit small. There we go. Thank you.
So this is an example of a bigger company. Netflix obviously is pretty big now, using Vue.js. So if someone wanted to just kind of browse through the architecture, I think it's a great example of how to use Vue plus Vuex, which is the equivalent of Redux for state management, and then the Vue router as well.
Go back up real quick because I wanted to ask a question. So you mentioned the architecture, and I believe that the architecture is probably pretty sound here, but their hierarchy system seems a little insane. So it's dispatch, source, dispatch, static, dispatch. Yeah. There was another source file.
Yeah. They have their front end and their back end in the same repo.
Okay.
So the back end is, I'm too far. So the back end is actually at this level, and then the front end is actually in the static.
Oh, interesting.
Folder. So I'm not a huge fan of that, especially for this size of application. If you're just creating like a little blog for yourself, that might be reasonable, but.
So how do you manage that? So you mentioned that you're not a fan of like that kind of all-in-one solution-esque type formatting where you have the server and the client bits together. Why would you not be a fan of that? Because from my perspective, I've always kind of liked that because there's parity then with the contracts between the API and what the client has to consume. So like, how do you manage that?
I'm not necessarily not a fan of it. I think situation dictates in that case. There's certainly times where for smaller teams or applications that makes sense. The times that it doesn't make sense is if you have two separate teams working on an application, a team working on the front end and a team working on the back end, you're probably going to want to version those separately. Another scenario is if you're using the APIs for more than just powering the front end, right, for mobile or integration, you're probably going to want to release those on different life cycles. So, I hate to keep saying it, but it depends.
Yeah. Like everything in programming, it depends, right? And there's going back to the debate of like which SPA framework to use. The problem is there's opinions, and there's opinions everywhere, and everyone's got strong opinions, and those opinions differ. So it's totally valid, right? Whatever makes you happy, whatever tool, just knowing that there's a different tool for different jobs, and everyone can agree to disagree.
Yeah. To your point, though, if it were me doing something like this, I would much rather see, this folder be called backend or something, and then the front end be sitting right next to it. That way I don't have to traverse. Because like I read this blog post that they were open sourcing it, and it was built on Vue and Vuex. I'm like, oh, gotta check that out. But it admittedly took me a little bit to find it.
So I think, Matt, you had Visual Studio open, and then I started rambling. Apologies.
No
I think we should probably bump up the size just a little bit here, if you don't mind, for our viewers.
Yeah, it's really hard to see.
Cool.
So this is Visual Studio Code, which is really nice to zoom with, based on Chromium. Little shout out there. So I think it's interesting, first of all, that you're using Visual Studio Code. A lot of times we'll see Visual Studio proper being used, and you've got C# in here. So I appreciate the .NET Core love and the tooling there. Have you been using VS Code for all of the development then, or do you kind of switch over? I know that there's different, certain developers will just stick with one or the other, and some will actually go back and forth between the two. So what's your programming style here?
I do go back and forth between them. Front end, I for sure use VS Code for. If it's a simple API or a simple .NET project, I'll probably use VS Code as well. If I get into anything that has more than one project, I tend to go back to VS proper. I don't really have a good reasoning for it, just kind of how I'm comfortable, and it's easier to navigate about types and things like that. So, and the don't get me wrong, VS Code IntelliSense is amazing, but it's not VS IntelliSense. So I'm too comfortable with that.
So we've got a question here. MS on YouTube is actually asking, what's the extensions that's being used here within VS Code for the .NET Core web dev experience?
So I'm not an extension junkie. I'm not gonna lie, but I think all I really have is the C# extension, and that looks like about it for .NET.
Yeah, I think that's the one I use too, and it brings in all of the .NET Core tooling experience, and it's got, yeah, okay, awesome.
Yeah, it's that C# extension that would absolutely be required, and that's powered by OmniSharp. That extension is all open source on GitHub, so just search for OmniSharp, OMINI Sharp, if that interests you, and you can see what that's all about.
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's take a look at the code now. I mean, so we've seen some of the file structure here. Let's actually, I'm curious how we are ingesting Vue.js into our, what appears to be CS HTML, which is Razor.
Yep. So let me hop over to my browser quick just to show what this will look like. So you can see here I'm on 5001, and I'm on a post page to see blog posts. And if I go into one of these, I can see my post content and I can edit, yada, yada, yada. But then I have this comment form here. So I can leave this comment and save it. And you'll notice that my page didn't refresh or anything like that. So going back to the whole dynamic thing, I just wanted to take this one component and make it a little bit more dynamic, and did not want to use jQuery. So this is the view post view, and you can see that I have standard Razor syntax for some of the bits, and then you can see that I have these curly braces, and that's kind of where the view fun starts.
So Matt, we have a question here before we go any further. As far as a web server, are you using IIS to host this application, or are you using something else?
I'm using Kestrel for this specific application.
Okay, so you're bypassing the reverse proxy, just going straight to Kestrel.
Yep. So it's just .NET Run is all I'm doing here.
Awesome, thanks.
So I'm actually going to scroll down the page a little bit more. And you'll notice that I have a section for scripts. And in that, I have a...
Real quick, what's this @ section syntax do? So okay, I'm curious. Yeah. So @ section.
So this is it's a section. So it's going to reference my layout file. And if I scroll down here, you'll see a render section scripts. So that's basically a way for you to tell MVC or Razor, I want to take this content and render it somewhere other than where my render body is. So in this case, I want it to be rendered in HTML after all of my other scripts have been rendered.
Got it. And it says required false, so that means it's optional. So if we close the layout here and we go back, so it's basically going to render this bit of content in that section.
Correct.
Got it. Cool. Thank you.
If I turn that required to true, as soon as I tried to run the page, it would throw an error.
Okay.
So sections are really handy for adding stuff to the header and the footer and whatever else, you would maybe want outside of your typical body. So I
So,
made a
so yeah, this view script partial. So I'm guessing there's a partial view somewhere that has the details for that.
Yep. So as I kind of mentioned before, Vue.js itself is really light, which is one of the things that attracts me to it. So if I want to include Vue.js in my project, I can literally include one line in my code, and that's all I have to do to include it. I don't have to worry about Webpack. I don't have to worry about anything else.
That's awesome. And this is conditional based on your environment. So that's what those little tags are. Environment include. So when it's development environment, this will pull in this script, right, which is the distribution.
Yep.
And then, okay, neat.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but by taking this approach here, using a CDN to pull in the Vue.js library, there's no need to do an npm install anywhere in this project. Is that correct?
Correct. You'll see in this project I have nothing about package.json or npm.
Oh my God, you just made my day. So so instead of dealing with the nightmare that is npm.js and having like literally every single JavaScript file that's ever existed on my box and multiple directories copied all the time, we can just do it dynamically. That's so cool. Perfect.
Side anecdote to that, if you've ever looked at a build server that uses npm and doesn't clean up after itself, it's a great time.
I'd love it.
So yeah, I make this little partial as a convenience thing for me. So because I do want to include different sources depending on which environment I'm in, but by no means do you have to. You can just take this single script line and plop it in your normal Razor file.
Yeah, so that means that instead of having like in your layout for every single page that may not be opting into actually using Vue.js, rather than doing that, it's wherever you want it. So it's opt-in, you pull in the partial, and then away you go.
Exactly.
One other thing I'll mention, since we're talking about CDNs and single-page apps, there is this tool that Microsoft has. It comes from our web tooling team, and it's called libman, which is short for Library Manager. Library Manager or libman could also be used to retrieve files from CDNs, like the one that Matt's using here. The advantage of using libman over just a solution like what's being used here is you can define, or you can specify rather, which files from that CDN are installed into your project. And so, for me, I've found, okay, I typically don't want the library's package.json file in my project, but I do want maybe the minified version of that one JS file. With libman, I can tell it it's that minified JS file that I want and nothing more.
Yeah, I've heard of libman. I've admittedly not used it yet, but I would like to try it out.
I will put a link in the chat if libman is something that sounds interesting.
Does that work with VS Code as well? I've only seen it used in VS Proper.
Yeah, so there's two flavors of libman. There is the version that's baked into Visual Studio. So if you were to right-click a folder in Solution Explorer and say it's something like Manage Client Libraries, you can access the UI that way. Alternatively, there's a .NET Core Global tool that you can install so that you could use this inside of VS Code from the integrated terminal.
Very cool.
So yeah, back to your blog post thing.
Yeah. So I'm including the Vue libraries, and then this is where the fun really starts. So I have a declaration of my Vue app, which is just new Vue, and then I'm kind of specifying various properties, if you will. So the first one is I'm saying in this case, what element do I want to bind Vue to? So if we scroll back up a little bit, you'll see that my container for the comment section has an ID of comments. So I'm saying to bind this Vue instance to that element. And then I'm specifying the data. So this is effectively the model, if you will, for that section. And I'm kind of specifying some defaults. So the comments is an empty array, and then the new comment is an empty object. One thing to note is that you have to, if you want to bind to something, you have to at least declare it in data. You can't, like, even though this is an empty object, I couldn't leave it out because Vue.js wouldn't bind properly.
So it's somewhat declarative, and there's well-known properties that we have to kind of build out with our new Vue instance. And element is EL, short for element, data being the other one. And to your point, within this data object, we have to have at least a declaration of the things that we want to be able to bind to.
Correct.
Okay.
And here I'm specifying the post ID, and you'll see that I'm actually injecting Razor right into this. Now that might seem messy, and in a large application, I would agree with that, but it's a really easy way to kind of bootstrap your Vue app with data that's coming from your controller.
And so, I've done the same thing before, actually, where you bind kind of into what would become your Vue instance, which is the client-side dynamic bits of JavaScript from a server-side model. I've done the same thing.
So just to reiterate for folks out there who might not be terribly familiar with Razor syntax, so what's going on there, Matt, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the script that is rendered to be sent to the browser then has that post ID property set to an integer and not that model ID, right?
Yep. So if we look at, that's a great point. If we look at the source, you'll see that post ID is just equal to 3 because .NET and Razor rendered that on page load.
Cool.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of how the server rendered framework and the client side framework can coexist. So you've got Razor executing on the server side in this case, and here's a great example of how that evaluates to 3.
And if it can even go beyond this, if you want to hydrate the entire post and you just don't want just the ID, you can actually serialize your model coming from the controller as a JavaScript object and set it to, another data attribute. So, and I've done that in the past too.
Okay, go on.
We're going to skip, I guess we'll hit created. So created is effectively what happens when the component is rendered or loaded on the page. And you can put in whatever functionality in here you want. So in my case, I'm just making a call to one of my other methods to refresh the comments.
And it's my understanding that these functions, that created event handler, so to speak, it's just a generic function. So that could even be like a promise returning thing where you do async and await and get into like that little async state machine within the context of JavaScript, right?
Right. Now, the one thing to note is that this JavaScript isn't being compiled or anything. So, whatever functionality you build here has to be runnable in the modern browsers. So, it's not as big of a deal nowadays, but could still be things that don't necessarily work if it's not being compiled by Babel or something like that.
So that's that makes me wonder, Matt. So if with Vue.js, what does the browser support look like? Let's say I'm working in an enterprise where I do have to support, say, an old version of Internet Explorer. Is it possible out of the box to do that with Vue.js, or does that require polyfills?
I think it's been a while since I've tried that. I think it requires polyfill mostly for Ajax functionality, if I recall correctly. But I'm just
Okay. Cool. I'm just looking at the chat. We have a great question here, and I wondered the same thing. So when you're considering the code that you have highlighted in VS Code, why was it that you decided to use the XML HTTP request versus something like fetch or Axios?
yeah, just to be as simple as possible, really, and use vanilla JavaScript as possible. I do love Axios, and in my full Vue.js projects, I do use Axios, but here I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that you can use whatever. You can use fetch, you can use Axios, whatever your heart desires, really. So and that's another great thing about Vue is that they don't tell you have to use Axios. You can use it and it works very nicely, but you don't have to.
Sure. We have another comment here that says David Pine is the man. I can't say we disagree, but while we're on the topic of David, I know he's a big Angular guy, and so David, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the discussion we were just having. How would you handle these XML HTTP requests with something like Angular?
Yeah, I guess one of the neat things about Angular is it comes with a native HTTP client, much like you'd expect with C#. So like in .NET Core and .NET Framework, you've had this amazing HTTP client, which allows you to make those requests and handle responses very fluently. The same is true with Angular. So I mean, it's again, there's many opinions, and I guess my opinion is to stick with whatever you're comfortable with, or whatever the team that you're developing in, whatever they advocate for or comfortable with, and it all depends. But yeah.
Well, and I think Matt mentioned fetch earlier. Isn't fetch the one that you and I have used in our projects that we've done, Scott?
Yeah, Cam and I helped a former team member build a project, and it required an API like this. We decided to use fetch. Just because that's what I was familiar with. No other reason.
Yeah, we use fetch at work for one of our React applications, which is nice. So
cool. What other interesting things are there in this Razor file that we're looking at?
So yeah, we'll just finish up with this one. So I'm doing an HTTP request, as you can see, and then when it's all done, I'm going to set self.comments to whatever response I get. Now, because of our lovely friend hoisting, I had to set self to this. Otherwise, this is going to be different. So that's loading my comments from the database. And then if we jump down to posting a comment, it's much the same, except I'm doing a post and I'm taking the data out of the Vue.js model, so to speak. So I'm saying this dot new comment dot name and dot text, and I'm sending that to the browser. So,
Matt, can you? I didn't quite follow where new comment was. Oh wait, I think you're about to show us, aren't you?
Yeah. So new comment was an object that I defined, no properties. To be even more declarative, I probably should do something like this, which is cool. But then let's go take a look at the HTML side of this. And this is one thing that I like, it kind of, Vue.js doesn't get in your way. It kind of sits there. And you can even render Vue attributes on a tag helper that was rendered by MVC if you want. So it's kind of cool.
So you can kind of go back and forth, almost like we talked about before, with some of our binding and whatnot, and that's really neat. So you get declarative binding here, and that's some of the templating around it. So on like line 35, for example, we've got this form, so that v-on submit.prevent. So that's, I'm assuming that's specific to Vue.js, right?
Yeah, this is a Vue event handler, and it's saying on submission of this form, and this is going to do the prevent default, just like you would do if you were using jQuery or something like that.
So it prevents the default, but we still have this post comment function, right? And that's part of the functionality that we've declared back in our new Vue instance. So it calls into that.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
So then I'm only displaying that if new comment is an object, essentially. And then if we look down at line 39 here, if I can click, I'm saying the model for this particular element is new comment.name. So that's going to bind my name to this property.
Got it. I'm with you now. So that makes a lot of sense. So out of curiosity, one thing that I would be really hoping it has evolved is the tooling story for this. So do you get like like statement completion and refactoring? Does it have any way to like look at that template and give you like statement completion to say like, okay, I know that this is actually binding to this data object called new comment over here that's part of this Vue.js state thing that we created? Like, does that evolve that far yet? Or
and in the Razor files, I would say no, just because Razor's not really expecting to know about Vue.
Okay.
But I do have a Viter. I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's how it looks. An extension for Visual Studio Code, and it works pretty well in normal Vue files, but it doesn't, they don't expect us to use or to have IntelliSense on a Razor
Got it.
file.
Okay, so this is actually like a VS Code extension, and this is the Vue language server, which gives you like full language server support for VS Code.
Yep.
But in the context of like Vue files, like the .vue file, not a Razor or CS/HTML file, is what you're saying, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, got it.
Yep. So does that kind of make some sense?
Oh yeah,
This all comes together.
That's really neat.
So I know we're running a little bit short on time, but I wanted to point out another way that I like combining Vue and .NET Core together. And here you will see that we do have some NPM action going on. And if I go to the right window, so this is another another MVC application, and I can kind of browse around and have routing. So this page is rendered by MVC. As soon as I go to /admin, that is actually rendered by Vue.js. So I can kind of navigate around here, and you'll see that my URLs are still changing, but I'm not actually doing full page refreshes.
Oh, interesting. So then you're actually leveraging both like the server side routing and the client side stuff. So once you're under the admin route, that's where Vue.js and lets you do the client side routing. That's really neat.
This is my favorite way to use SPA libraries. You have what I call pockets of SPAs within an ASP.NET application. So you're not going all in, you're only using that SPA functionality where it makes the most sense, where the user experience really needs to be rich.
So maybe SPA isn't the right acronym, because it's not a single page application. It's like a multi-page, whatever.
It's like a, what's the equivalent of microservice in SPA land?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So one of the interesting things to note to do that is this is my admin controller, and it's a pretty dumb controller. It has one action, and the route on the controller level is admin, and then I'm doing a wildcard binding to to this action, and I'm not actually even using the parameter. Um, the reason you need this is if if I'm navigating through here and I go from MVC land to view land, this will work fine. But if I didn't have this wildcard,
Oh, okay. Because that way it basically eats it and lets it be anything in the path.
right? So
Okay.
if I refresh this now, I would get 404 or a blank page. So you need that wildcard binding, or not binding, wildcard route to make this work. So then, you can send someone a link and it will still work when they initially load it.
So do you even need to have like the path variable name, or can you just put like the asterisk there and leave the wildcard and omit the thing altogether? Like if you were to just get rid of path and the string path variable, I'm curious if that would work.
That's actually a really good question. Let's find out.
I tend to ask really good questions.
You do very well. Parameter name is invalid.
I guess not. Revert, undo.
And it's kind of interesting that it didn't work.
Yeah, that's neat though.
We have a question in the chat for you, Matt,
Yeah.
here, and the question is around the architecture. Is there any kind of microservices architecture you're using in the solution that you're showing us?
Not really. I mean, this example that I'm showing is meant to be pretty small and contained. I didn't, it's not meant to be like a full-fledged application. But, Vue.js would play very well in that land, I believe.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So if you're curious as a follow-up for microservices architecture, we've had a few recent episodes, in fact, discussing that pretty in-depth. We had Cecil Phillip on and Chase Oakwine, and they went into quite a bit of detail, kind of showing off some of the different benefits to microservices architecture, and plenty of resources there. So if you go to .NET docs.dev, our website, and look at our past episodes, you'll find those.
Yeah. I would also throw out a shameless plug for Microsoft Learn. Cam and myself have been developing a microservices learning path for ASP.NET Core, focused on all aspects of microservices. So definitely check that out, and I will put a link to that in the chat.
Very cool.
Cool. Well, I was going to say, we're getting close here, Matt. Is there any kind of final closing thoughts or suggestions or sales pitch maybe for Vue.js to encourage people? I would like to add real quick that I see people here in our chat on YouTube saying that this has been very, very helpful, and they're actually they want to start using Vue.js right now. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I would strongly encourage you to, whether like Cam is just starting to get into front end, or you're sick of React or Angular. It's one of the few front end things I actually enjoy working with. I'm much more of a .NET guy, like I said before, but I've always liked tinkering in front end. I can't design to save my life. That's why you'll see me use Bootstrap all over the place.
Yeah, I know that pain.
Yeah. I get crap for it all the time, but actually, I'm going to pitch that real quick. So, if you do use Bootstrap and you like, and I don't know who actually really likes Bootstrap these days, but
I do.
Oh, good. I'm not alone then. There's a fantastic set of components built on top of Bootstrap for Vue.js. And I use these pretty extensively given my lack of design skills. But they wrap all of the form elements, and they do a really nice job of
That's
making
really neat.
combine Vue.js and Bootstrap together. So I'll share a link to this.
I just dropped one in the chat.
Oh, cool.
Matt, we have another question for you here. How can we use TypeScript? I know it's definitely possible.
Yeah.
The first question would be, is it something you considered doing?
I actually have. I was hoping to get to that project, and this I just started tinkering with TypeScript and Vue. There's two different ways you can go about it. I wouldn't say ways, but there's two different patterns. The pattern I'm doing is I'm doing more of my service layer in TypeScript, and I'm still doing the kind of the components in regular JavaScript. But I would encourage you to look at John Galloway and Cecil Phillip did the URL list. They did that in Vue.js and TypeScript, and it's a really good example. So I can get a link to that and share it in chat if you would like.
And thank you for the thank you for the question about TypeScript. I'm a huge advocate for TypeScript, and I will leave everyone here with one final message of encouragement. Only you can prevent JavaScript.
I think I've heard David refer to TypeScript as training wheels for JavaScript. Is that true?
That is very true. Yeah, I've got a bunch of sketches I've done, but yeah, TypeScript is definitely the way to go, in my opinion, and hopefully we can provide some resources here. Yeah, so the screen that he pulled up here, this is .vue, and that's some of the differences, right? So this is how you can actually enable TypeScript with Vue.js, right?
Yeah. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at it. But that's another thing I like about it over something like Angular, where you have to use TypeScript, and David's saying that's a plus. But for those that don't want to use TypeScript, you don't have to. You can take your pick.
Awesome. This has been great. Yeah, hopefully you guys follow Millican Matt here, and this has been an awesome episode.
Thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
So we should probably call out that next Monday is a U.S. holiday, but we're still going to be streaming.
It's going to be a special one because we're going to actually open up the source code for our website, and we're going to let John Skeet hack on it. And John Skeet is going to run rampant. And as you know, he's going to basically he's going to murder all of our code. It's going to be great.
In fact, he's preemptively getting started at murdering your camera, I see.
I started talking about him, and they're like, boom, done. Kill this camera. It's going to be awesome, though. I'm super excited for it. That's why we're going to do it on a holiday. We don't even care. Hopefully, we've got a lot of people interested in that. So we'll see you next week. Thank you so much again, Matt.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast.
All right. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.
Bye.